All right, junior high, 7th and 8th grade, just want to go over your history lesson with you. You have chapter 27 this week. I hope you're excited. We're getting close to the end of the book, and that means the end of the semester. So I'm sure a lot of you are excited. I mentioned it in the introduction video, but I miss you all. It was weird celebrating Easter yesterday, not with the church family. I mean, I've been in church for Easter pretty much for as long as I can remember, and so yesterday was a little bit different. It was a bummer not seeing a lot of you. But I hope you enjoyed the weekend with your family and maybe some friends. I hope you're enjoying your time at home. I'm sure a lot of you are bored out of your minds, but maybe not, since some of you just play video games all day anyway. Nothing has changed. You're like, wait, what? We can't go outside? I didn't do that anyway. So here's the deal. Chapter 27, I want you to read through the chapter on your own, and then you should still have your history packets. I sent out all of the worksheets you were going to need in an email a couple weeks ago, and so you can go back to that email and print out the ones for this week, chapter 27. So I'm going to read the introduction and then a couple of the highlights in here for you, okay? As we round the last quarter before the finish line of our study together, we are going to see how world culture began to change in numerous ways. More unity was achieved in some ways, but humankind will never be truly united here on this earth. There will always be disagreements and conflicts, and in this chapter we are going to follow the journey towards the collapse of the Soviet Union. The massive giant of the Eastern Hemisphere that had been shielded behind the wall of communist ideology was about to loosen its grip on the smaller satellite republics it had gathered in along its western border. Also in this chapter, we are going to look at the difficult concept of the use of terrorism in our modern times. Although at this point in history, terrorism has become almost an accepted fact of life, it is important to understand that it is a worldwide issue that we as Christ followers need to be diligent in praying about. We as Christians must not let anger or hatred for these lost and sometimes evil people to take root in our hearts. Instead, we need to take Romans 12:17 seriously, which says, not to repay evil with more evil. Okay? So we're going to be discussing the end of one century and the beginning of another one. Talking about how we learned how Russia formed the Soviet Union after the end of World War I. Remember a couple of chapters ago we talked about World War I and then World War II. So the Soviet Union was formed after World War I and dramatically gained influence after World War II. Their communist ideals clashed especially with the United States, and the two giants entered a time period called the Cold War. The Soviet Union was a member of the United Nations and used their veto power to stop any disarmament plans that would bring action against their own aggression. So, as you read through this paragraph, you're going to learn a little bit about the Cold War, which would be the Soviet Union versus the United States. You'll read about a man named Stalin, who had died in March 1953. He was replaced by a series of rulers who moved the Soviet Union along in a somewhat moderate direction. Advances in Soviet technology and science brought great concern from the West, as did their nuclear weapons arsenal. See, the Soviets were starting to get nuclear weapons, which had a lot of Americans concerned because if they just launched them all into America, we didn't really know what we were going to do. In the 1960s, there were talks between the West and the United States did not get very far. In 1962, John F. Kennedy, a U.S. president, demanded that the Soviets remove their missiles from Cuba. If you were with me in the America Story volumes, you might recall that we learned about this incident, which history calls the Cuban Missile Crisis. So as you read through this chapter, you'll learn more and more about the Soviets. You'll learn that the United States withdrew. Starting in this paragraph right here. In 1985, a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet leader. Gorbachev was a different type of communist ruler. Within a few years of coming to power, he signed an arms reduction agreement with the United States and withdrew the Soviet forces from Afghanistan, where they had been stationed for 9 years. So he was pulling the troops back out of Afghanistan. He was trying to at least develop a little bit of peace with the United States, and he arranged a summit with the Chinese leaders. The two communist nations had long disagreed about a lot of issues and hadn't spoken to each other in a very long time. Although the meeting with China did not go very well, the action on Soviet leaders' parts showed that he wanted change. So you'll learn more and more about Gorbachev as you read through this chapter. Here's a picture of unrest in the Soviet Republic during the founding years of the Soviet reunion. You can see those pictures there and some of the unrest that was happening. Towards the end of all of this, Gorbachev shifted the power from himself to a guy named Boris Yeltsin, a man who had stood against the coup, and a transitional state council was established to decide the future of the country. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all Baltic republics, were given independence in September of 1991. Now, I know a lot of you were born, I think all of you were born in the 2000s, but that's only 4 years before I was born, so it's not that long ago. In the Connect, you'll learn more about Mikhail Gorbachev and how he was a Soviet ruler who brought an end to the communist rule in Soviet Union. You'll learn that 2 years before this momentous night, American President Ronald Reagan had stood in front of the wall during the trip to West Berlin and called for Gorbachev to open the gate and tear down the wall. You can look up a recording of that speech. It's a very famous speech, and you should listen to it if you have the chance. Then 2 years later, on November of 1989, the gates were open and the wall came down. The world watched as the people of Berlin took hammers and picks to the giant wall that had divided them from their neighbors for decades. Throughout the following hours, the wall was knocked down with bulldozers and cranes. On one section of the wall, a Berlin citizen spray-painted these words: "Only today is the war really over." A couple of pictures here. A memorial to one of the dozens of people killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall. And then President Reagan during his tear down this wall speech in 1987. Again, you can look that speech up if you want to listen to it. You'll have a chart here. It says that the EU has 5 main government institutions. The European Parliament, along with the Council of the European Union, had many responsibilities, of which making EU laws is perhaps the most important. Parliament members are elected directly by the citizens of the countries being represented and are organized into these different areas, okay? So on the blue line, you have citizens of the member states, and then in the circles, you have parliament and governments of the member states, which go up to the European Court of Justice or the European Central Bank. On the right-hand side, they go into European Parliament, and you have direct elections every 5 years. And then you can see how each one ends up into the European Commission, which needs the consent of both. You can see the story and read or see the pictures of the bombing of the American Embassy, as well as the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York City, September 11th, 2001. In case you didn't make the connection, that would be 9/11, the day we remember every year. Which was one of the worst terrorism attacks that this country has ever seen, where planes were basically flown into the World Trade Center to destroy it. A lot of people died, and that's why we take time to remember it every year. People who lost their lives, as well as the public servants who rescued a lot of people out of the rubble. So you can continue reading there. You'll get to eventually down here to the church history, which talks about missionary work in modern times, how it looks a little bit different than it did in past centuries. We talked a lot about missionaries in this book, and there was a lot of different stories we looked at. And there's some pretty crazy things that a lot of missionaries did, but that's a little bit different than the way that missionaries work today, you know? Throughout the world, there are many organizations that train missionaries to work even in countries that are officially closed to mission workers. Not every country is okay with people coming over and preaching the gospel. So sometimes missionaries have to be a little creative in how they go over. Someone going to a country that doesn't want people, which is called a closed country, may have to go as a teacher and teach English or teach history or something. And the country's like, oh yeah, he's a history teacher. He can come. And then he's also going around preaching the gospel. The author's family attends a Christian Missionary and Alliance Church that sponsors both the training of many missionary families and their work on the missions fields. There are several of these families who work in countries that are undisclosed, even to those of us in their home church. In centuries past, missionaries were individuals or groups of individuals who trained long hours to travel into foreign countries to spread the gospel of Christ. In our time period, we are all missionaries. We all have a responsibility to take the gospel of Christ to other people, and that makes us a missionary. You may not be going to another country, you may just be going across the street to a friend's house, but you have just as much responsibility as people like the Walters, right? We know them pretty well. We've been talking to them in class. You have just as much responsibility as they do to tell people about Jesus Christ. Just because they're doing it in Japan, and then you can do it here. So there's a picture of a missionary family in Peru. And then Brussels, which is the capital of Belgium. You got the Belgium food. I've heard that Belgium has really good food. A popular treat is frites or frites. I don't know how you say that. Americans would call them French fries, though Americans usually eat their fries with ketchup. Belgians usually eat their fries with mayonnaise. So that looks pretty good. I don't know about putting mayonnaise on a French fry, but it looks pretty good to me. And then several other pictures here to go through. But I want you to go through the chapter. I want you to read through the material and fill out your packet. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll try and put out another video going over the packet, explaining the questions and giving you your answers